Okay, we are back for another week in 2 Samuel. Let me go ahead and start with a prayer before we get into this chapter. Lord, please give us insight, understanding, and the ability to comprehend the information that's in this chapter. We thank you for this history, and we see, or hopefully we see, what it also tells us above and beyond the actual history that's in this chapter. So we thank you for always being with us and for your Holy Spirit guiding us in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, now, this is a difficult chapter. I'm not sure how many hours I spent on it, but a lot.
This is chapter 8.
Chapter 8. And of course, usually we find that when there's lots of names and lots of countries and lots of kings' names, it gets more complicated. Now, basically what this chapter is about, and I've handed out these maps, and for those on YouTube, there's going to be a map that's going to be up on YouTube so you can look at the same map. It will be, when it's put up for you, it will be this map. And so you'll be able to look at it on YouTube. It'll be on there so you can follow what I'm saying on the map because it's kind of important. So basically, this chapter is a summary of the wars of King David that the Lord led him to have. Okay? It is not, when you read this, these wars are not necessarily simultaneous back to back. They probably occur over a period of several years, but they're put together in a history or a collection of these wars. And of course, the purpose of these wars are that it expands greatly the territory of Israel, which is part of the Davidic promise that we went through in chapter 7. Now, you don't have to study or remember every single name or person, certainly. But in going through this, I hope you see the bigger picture. And at the end of it, I'm going to suggest to you that not only is it a history of what occurred during David's reign, but it's also a typology. And I'll try to show you evidence that it is a typology. Okay? So that's our goal for tonight. Now, it's also the fulfillment of another prophecy. And you might want to turn back to Genesis 15. Genesis 15 is the Abrahamic covenant. And I'll read the promise here. It's verses 18 through 21 of Genesis 15. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants, I have given this land, and notice the territory, the boundaries, from the river Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. Now, if you look on your map that I handed to you, you're going to see that's a pretty big territory. From obviously the extreme south of Israel, okay, into literally the southern area of Mesopotamia. Now, it's interesting for a number of reasons. Number one, he has a lot of conquest of some of these kings in the area of Mesopotamia, and therefore takes control over some of those areas, which is very, very far north of Israel. As I said, it's where Abraham came from, although he came a little bit even more northeast in Mesopotamia. So the thing that's interesting when you look at this Genesis description is that up until this point, Israel's never had any territory like this. So they're promised a territory in Genesis 15, and we go for hundreds and hundreds, really, probably 1,200 years to the time of David from Abraham. And only during the time of David is there a fulfillment of this promise. So it's kind of an interesting promise. Now, let me start, and we're going to read each verse, and I'm going to try to describe to you what's going on in each verse as we proceed, because there's a lot of information. So verse 1, now after this, it came about that David defeated the Philistines and subdued them, and David took control of the chief city from the hand of the Philistines. Okay? Now, David had already had war we find it in chapter 5, verse 17 and following, where he pushed the Philistines back into the coastland of Philistia. Remember, there are 5 major cities of the Philistines. Okay? It's called the Pentapolis, these 5 cities. They were ruled by different leaders, but they also were a united empire, especially when it came to war. Okay? So David previously had pushed them back to the coast where they originally were. But this is a different movement, and that is that David invades Philistia, and you'll see especially the city of Gath. Let me show you. Hold your place here in 2 Samuel and turn over. We're gonna go to 1 Chronicles 18 frequently. So go over, holding your place there, to 1 Chronicles 18. Verse 1. It gives you more specific information. Now, after this, it came about that David defeated the Philistines and subdued them and took Gath and its towns from the hands of the Philistines. Chapter 18 is a partial reiteration of what we're studying here in 2 Samuel 8. Okay? But sometimes it adds a little bit more information to it. So, it's interesting that if you look in the Hebrew at this verse, this mention of the city, it's the word methegama. Methegama. And it means the bridal of the mother, which is kind of a strange statement, isn't it? But remember, the mother, that is the leading force, the central figure, however you want to put it, has a bridle. The bridle is on the other 4 cities of Philistia. Okay? So it's speaking of Gath as being the central power source there of these 5 cities. So it's the chief city. It's the head of the 5 of this, what we call the Pentapolis. What happens, you notice, is that after David invades and takes over Gath, then he sets up a garrison there to control this city. And of course, it's kind of ironic if you think about what we've studied, particularly in 1 Samuel, because in 1 Samuel, we have the story of David running from Saul. And where does he finally end up in running from Saul?
In Philistine territory.
Yeah, to King Achash of Gath. Even further, you see that David allies himself to find safety when he ends up being allowed to go to this town of Ziklag. Remember, we studied towards the end of 1 Samuel Ziklag. And from there, he becomes a mercenary of the Philistines going into other towns in the south and in the southeast, of course, gaining spoil, and then taking some of it, and we, from the text, we get the idea, not all of it, back to Achash. So he is protected by Achash, but turns around now in this time and attacks Gath and subdues Philistia. Okay? Now, so this represents the far west expansion of the Israel territory during the time of David, the Davidic Empire. All right, that verse 2, let's go back to our 2 Samuel. And he defeated Moab and measured them with the line, making them lie down on the ground. And he measured 2 lines to put to death and 1 full line to keep alive. And the Moabites became servants to David, bringing tribute. So he moves then to the southeast. If you see it here on your map, you see where Moab is down here on your map?
Yeah, where Ruth was from.
Yes, where Ruth was from. Okay. So he moves into the Moabite territory and ends up warring with them and captures them, and of course ends up subduing them. Previously, you'll notice that David, if you remember 1 Samuel, if you remember 1 Samuel 22, when we covered 1 Samuel verses 3 and 4, he was friendly with Moab at that point as he was being chased by Saul. And if you remember in that text, when we taught 1 Samuel, he even actually asked for the king of Moab to take care of and to protect his mother and father.
Mm-hmm.
You remember that in the text? So previously had friendly relations with Moab, but now, of course, he has no friendly relationships. And as you see here, when he conquers Moab, he kills 2 out of 3 males there in Moab. Now, you think about that and you go, that seems pretty ruthless to kill 2 out of 3 males. That's a pretty big genocide. Would you not agree? Okay, so the question becomes why? Why would he do that? So let me try to explain why I think he does it. All right. First of all, we find do you know what the Midrash is? The Midrash is a rabbinic commentary on the Old Testament. And it draws many times in that commentary documents or information that the rabbis had available to them. Okay? In other words, information that's extra biblical, and they bring it into the commentary of the Midrash. Well, in the Midrash, talking about this chapter, the rabbis state that eventually the king of Moab kills David's parents.
Oh.
Okay? So that could be one explanation about why he's so harsh on his treatment of the Moabites. I think there's a second reason, though. And why don't we look at that? Why don't you hold your place here? And I want you to go to 1 Chronicles 11. Okay? 1 Chronicles 11. You're going to be moving around a bit on this tonight, because there's some additional information here in 1 Chronicles 11 that is not in 2 Samuel 8. Now, it's in verse 22. So, it says that this warrior of David named Benaiah, he is the son of this guy, and it says he's a valiant man of mighty deeds, and it says he struck down the 2 sons of Ariel of Moab. Okay? Now, it sounds like from the text in the English that Ariel means the father of these 2 sons of Moab. And the text doesn't sound like that. But if you read it in the Hebrew, that's not what it says. it says that he struck down 2 Ariel. And what that means, if you look it up in the Hebrew, it means lion-like hybrids.
That's what
Hybrids.
the Russian translation says.
Does it read it?
Two aerials.
Yeah. So in other words, apparently he's dealing with some remnant of the giants that are still left in Moab. And so this guy goes and cuts them down. Now, for further proof, go to the next verse, because the context in the next verse, I think, proves the truth of what is being said there. And he says, and he killed an Egyptian, a man of great stature, 5 cubits tall. Okay, 5 cubits based on the royal cubit is a little bit short of 9 feet. So he also kills another giant who apparently came from Egypt. And of course, it says the Egyptian's hand was in his hand was a spear like a weaver's beam. And of course, you know that from Goliath. He also had a spear the size of a weaver's beam when David defeated him. So the second reason why maybe he did this is because there are hybrid entities, leftover giants from the original Nephilim that apparently are in this territory. And so he's kind of eliminating some of these individuals so that they obviously can't continue.
Is that why you measured them with a cord?
The measurement of the cord, well, maybe. The allegation of the commentators of what that means is that it's like a cord being stretched out between 3 men laying down on the ground, face down. 2 are taken to kill and 1 is left. But that is an interpretation. And maybe you're right. Maybe the interpretation, exactly. Maybe the interpretation is that the measuring is actually of the height of these men. Therefore, 2 out of 3 of them were found to be of exceeding height. That's possible too. So that's a good point, Jan. Now, so let's go to verse 3. Are you following me so far? Okay. All right, 3.
Except who was the man Benaiah?
He was a champion of David and in David's army.
Okay.
Okay. So verse 3. Then David defeated Hadadezer, the son of Rehob, king of Zobah, as he went to restore his rule at the river. Now, this is why you need a map. Okay?
Is that the Euphrates?
It's the Euphrates. The river, capital V, is always in reference to the Euphrates. So what you see here is that the area, it's not giving actually you see up where it says Hamath? Okay? There's the northern area of Aram. Aram is today partially modern day Syria. That would be Aram. Okay? So they have this king, and his name is Hadadezer. Hadad is a term for the sun god of the Syrians. Okay? So that's why he ends up naming himself Hadadezer. So what happens is that this area of Aram up here, Damascus and above it, you see it on your map? Okay? David, what happens is that he had a battle up there around Damascus and even to the north of it, defeated this guy, Hadadezer, who is the son of the king of, quote, Zobah. Zobah, it doesn't show it exactly on this map that I see here, but Zobah is a town or an area even further north up here. So it's even to the very north area of this map.
So how many How many kilometers or miles are we looking at here?
You know, I didn't figure that. It's a good question.
The scales at the bottom.
Oh, yeah, okay, there, so I would say, what would you guess? From Jerusalem, you're probably talking about 200, 300 miles?
So what is your thinking in terms of the marching time and what it took to get there?
It's gonna take a while to take a group of soldiers that probably, from what we know from the number they defeated, because many times they defeated 18,000 or 20,000 people in a text we'll get to. So, I mean, you must have, I would assume, a force of 50,000? I'm guessing, there's no number given to us, but if I had to guess, I would guess that maybe that would be the size of David's force taken up there, 40 or 50,000. And so you're marching that size of an army basically about 300 miles north.
Plus you got all the supplies, their weapons,
Absolutely.
everything that's necessary for them to enter into battle.
Yeah, it is a big group of people. It is a big support group. A lot of wagons, horses that would certainly go along with them. Now, so what we see is, of course, that Hadadezer controlled land further to the northeast, which is into the southern part of Mesopotamia. And as it says in the text, in verse 3, it says, I'm sorry, in verse 3, at the end, it says they rule to the river. And of course, as was said, the river, as you see it on your map on the left side, is the Euphrates. So he's really moving up into the area of Mesopotamia in the process of these battles. The reference in verse 4 to Zobah is just south of, on your map, you see Hamath on your map at the top on the left side. Just south of that, or in that area, is this empire, smaller empire called Zobah. So that's what he's referring to. You can see reference to it. If you want to turn from here, you can go to 2 Samuel 10. And in verse 16, there's another reference, 15 and 16, in 2 Samuel 10. It says, when the Arameans, and that's the area we're talking about, of this north of Syria, Damascus area, okay? It says, when the Arameans saw that they had been defeated by Israel, they gathered themselves together, and Hadadezer sent and brought out the Arameans. That is a group of people that are nation allied to him, even a little bit farther north. And it says, who were beyond the river, in other words, north of the area of the Euphrates. And it says that they came to Halam, and Sobach, the commander of the army of Hadadezer, led them. And of course, what happens is that there's a battle, and in verse 18, but the Arameans fled before Israel. David killed 700 charioteers in the Arameans and 40,000 horsemen. Now think about that. That's a 40,000 horsemen cavalry. In ancient days, a cavalry was a war horse. Cavalry was a very impressive military asset that could do a lot of damage. It can create a lot of fear in foot soldiers. And David had foot soldiers, okay? He captures a few chariots in the process, we see, but this is a foot soldier force that David is commanding here. So it demonstrates, I think, that he was an unbelievably adept strategist in how he went about these battles to win them like this, to go as far as he did, and to, of course, go against the types of troops that he went against. As a matter of fact, you don't have to turn here, but in 1 Chronicles 18:4, if you go there, you'll see that it breaks down when it says back in chapter 8, when it says 1,500 horsemen and 20,000 foot soldiers that he captured. It breaks them down in 1 Chronicles 18:4, and it indicates that there were approximately 1,000 chariots and about 700 cavalry riders. Can you imagine foot soldiers going against 1,000 charioteers? That's tough. And yet they did it and they captured him. So tremendous strategist that he was. And certainly, I think it demonstrates what we'll see further in a few verses, and that is that these battles were, quote, led by the Lord.
Oh, yeah, they had to be.
They were led by the Lord. It was God doing whatever he needed to do in his strategy, leading David and making the way for the defeat of all these nations that we're looking at. Now, back in 2 Samuel 8, let's read verses 5 and 6. And when the Arameans of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, which we just read in chapter 10, that text we just read a few minutes ago, it says, king of Zobah, David killed 22,000 Arameans. So pretty good sized army he took down there. Verse 6, then David put garrisons among the Arameans of Damascus, and the Arameans became servants to David, bringing tribute, and the Lord helped David wherever he went. That's, of course, one of the key elements, and the Lord helped David wherever he went. So what happens is, as David captures these nations, he doesn't try to control their governments, but he puts military garrisons in their areas, in their capital cities, lets the native people run a government, but of course it's only under the supervision of the garrisons. Do you see what he's doing? He does this in capturing in the nations in the east and all the way to the south. When he does it with the Moabites, he always puts these garrisons in there for control. Now, of course, the Arameans are found in this area of Damascus, as you'll see on the map. And they originally, by history, came from northeast of that area, from the southern part of Mesopotamia, centuries prior, and settled there around Damascus, Syria. They came to help, of course, as we just read, King Hadadezer, and of course, David kills the troops. So as a result, David could occupy Damascus with, as we said, these garrisons. These are, of course, the Lord's planned victories. So let's read 7 and 8. And David took the shields of gold, which were carried by the servants of Hadadezer, and brought them to Jerusalem. And from Betah and from Barathe, cities of Hadadezer, King David took a very large amount of bronze. Now, what we're looking at here is, in capturing these nations, David took spoil or tribute from them. Okay? It had to do, in this case, with Hadadezer, with a whole bunch of bronze. We find, though, also, as we go on here, and we see other places that are captured. And as a matter of fact, I'm sorry, I'll just flip the page here. For instance, in verse 10, he also captures this area from Hadadezer and brings with them articles of silver, gold, and bronze. And we find that when we look at the silver, gold, and bronze that was dedicated, and we find reference to that there in chapter 10, verse 10, we see that what he captured was 666 talents of gold, which is equal to about 800,000 ounces of gold. And in another capture, 120 talents of gold, that's found in chapter 10, verse 10. You add them together, the 800,000 and the 144,000 ounces of gold, you come up with 944 ounces of gold, which at today's rate would be over $19 million in gold. Just there.
Yeah, but just handling that.
Oh, heavy, heavy, heavy.
Heavy.
Okay.
Unbelievable task.
Now, these are just from 2 cities that were captured by David of King Hadadezer. But he's going to capture way more too. Now, he also captures brass, we see, and in the Greek version of the Old Testament called the Septuagint, it says that the brass that was captured was used to build the laver and the bronze pillars for the temple. The point is here that David didn't take this for personal wealth, okay? He took all of this. Let's read verses 10 and 11, okay? And well, let me note particularly at the end of 11 to finish the point that King David dedicated this to the Lord, the silver and the gold that he had dedicated from all the nations which he took, which he had subdued. So none of this, all the spoil he took of all the precious metals of all these nations, he did not keep for his own personal sake. It was all dedicated to what was going to be used in the building of the temple and in the decoration of it. I think it's an important point. Now, in verses 9 and 10, let's read 9 and 10. It says that Toi sent Joram, his son, to King David to greet him and bless him because he had fought against Hadadezer and had defeated him. For Hadadezer had been at war with Toi, King Toi, and Joram, that is King Toi's son, brought with him articles of silver, gold, and bronze. So here's additional sources. This King Toi is grateful about the battle in defeating Hadadezer, the enemy of King Toi. And so he sends his son and takes a whole bunch of gold and silver and bronze and brings it to David, which again is used for what's going to be the building of the temple. Now, there's an interesting thing about King Toi. That is that Toi's territory was up here in your map. Up, you see up at the very top left the Orontes River, way up left in your map. Okay, if you go a little bit north of that, that's actually the territory of King Toi. Now, that's significant because historically, that is in the area of the empire of the Hittites. Okay, they're way up north there. Now, that's significant because up until fairly recently, we find that the archaeologists doubted the existence of the Hittites, saying that there had been no evidence of them, and therefore this reference here to the Hittite Empire must have been false. But, as is typical, as we dig further, we find that when we go to Egyptian cuneiform writings, we find multiple references to the Hittites, battles between Egypt and the Hittites, such that in the cuneiform writings, it indicates that for over 400 years, there were back and forth battles between Egypt and the Hittites. And in those cuneiform writings, it tells us all kinds of things about the Hittite Empire. So again, the Bible is proven correct. Okay? Now, there's a reference to all of this, if you want to look at it, and it's in Psalm 18. So you can hold your place here and move to your right to Psalm 18. Psalm 18, just went too far. Okay. I have a hard time getting to Psalm 18 somehow. All right. So, starting in verse 37, this is an account in the Psalms of these wars against these nations, okay?
You say 37?
Yes, starting through verse 37 of Psalm 18. He says, I pursued my enemies and overtook them, and I did not turn back until they were consumed. Notice, as you read this in the text in 2 Samuel 8, it's complete defeat of all these armies. Okay? He takes over these nations.
Do you know whether or not in your research what they did with the bodies after they've had these great wars?
No idea. I'm certain the locals had to bury them.
A mess.
Yeah, it would have been. Verse 38, I shattered them so that they were not able to rise. Again, remember the garrisons put in all these nations to control them? They fell under my feet. Verse 39, for thou hast girded me with strength for battle. Thou hast subdued under me those who rose up against me. Thou hast also made my enemies turn their backs to me, and I destroyed them who hated me. They cried for help, but there was none to save them, even to the Lord, but he did not answer them. Then I beat them fine as the dust before the wind. I emptied them out as mire or dust on the streets. Thou hast delivered me from the contentions of the people. Thou hast placed me as head of the nations. A people whom I have not known serve me. As soon as they hear, they obey me. Foreigners submit to me. Foreigners fade away and come trembling out of their fortresses. You get the idea?
Yeah.
The Lord was completely behind these wars to the point that no one could withstand David's army. To the point that the nations were fearful of him. It says, as we look a little bit further here, it's going to say that the Lord gave David a great name.
Were these people all witnessing to Baal? Were they all?
The northern tribe, the northern areas did, Damascus, Syria, Phoenicia, but they had they had the Arameans had other gods, Moabites had other gods. No, they were different.
And if those other gods that they created,
Mhm.
was that Satan that created them?
Mhm.
It just wasn't Baal at
Right.
that moment in time. Same thing,
Yeah.
but different.
Yeah, what we call them is the demigods. You know, and we see them both also in Greek mythology, Greek history, and also Roman too, demigods. But they are really what we know from Genesis 6 and other sources. They are fallen angel entities that are worshipped. That's really what they are. Okay. Now,
They're alive and well in this country.
yes, that's true. So let's go back to 2 Samuel 8. And let's read. So we saw in verse 11 that David dedicated all of this silver, gold of all the nations he collected and subdued from verse 12 from Aram, Moab, Aram being the area around Damascus, Moab, of course, to the east, southeast, Ammon also further south, the Philistines to the west, and Amalek, and from the spoil of Hadadezer that we just read, the son of Rohab, the king of Zobah. Okay, so he indeed takes over this territory that had never been taken over by Israel, but was promised to Abraham. This is the fulfillment of that.
What's the timeline on how long it took him to do this?
We don't know. It doesn't give us a timeline. We know at what age he took over Jerusalem. We know how long he reigned, 40 years.
Right.
But somewhere in the middle of that, these wars occurred, okay? Now let's read.
Did they occur when he was king or before he got to being king?
This was all his generalship.
Not king,
He was king and general, both.
both.
David, you'll see from many texts, even in 1 Kings, David always was with his troops. There's one time he wasn't with his troops,
Bathsheba. Yeah, Bathsheba.
which we're going to get to in another couple chapters, and that's the case of adultery with Bathsheba. It says it was the time of the spring when they went out for battles, but he didn't go. Major mistake. He was always meant to be the head and general as well as king of his troops. That's how he won. Okay? And we,
That time when he didn't go, was the Lord fully aware of what he was doing?
oh yes, and penalized him for it. Yes. So this is a very interesting thing because many kings of nations during this time, they did not go out in battle. They sent their commanders and their troops out. But this is interesting about David. He was there. He led his own troops, with one exception, which we're going to get to in a minute, okay? So verses 13 and 14. So David made a name for himself. Remember in Psalm, they feared him? Okay. He made a name for himself when he returned from killing 18,000 Arameans in the valley of the Salt. Now, it's interesting that we see that in this reference. Well, let me go also with verse 14. And he put garrisons in Edom, and in all of Edom he put garrisons, and all the Edomites became servants to David, and the Lord helped David wherever he went. Edom, of course, if you look at your map, is way down southeast. It's below the territory of Moab, okay, if you'll see in your map. It's as far southeast as you go before you actually enter into the area of the Sinai, okay? So there's a battle down there. Now, what we see, and I'm going to show you a reference, they invaded the south of the Dead Sea, okay? You see it, the Dead Sea on your map there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so they invaded there, and we see that, what you turn to 1 Chronicles 18. There's a clarification in 1 Chronicles 18. Verse 12. Moreover, Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, remember who Zeruiah is? She's a sister of David. So who's Abishai?
Husband.
No,
Or her
nephew.
Nephew.
Nephew. Remember, David has a lot of nephews. Okay? Joab's his nephew. There are a bunch of nephews. Okay? Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, defeated 18,000 Edomites in the valley of the Salt. Verse 13, he put garrisons in Edom, and all the Edomites became servants to David, and the Lord helped David wherever he went. What we believe happened in this verse, that is, where it says that, verse 13, David made a name for himself when he returned from killing 18,000 Arameans in the valley of the Salt, the Dead Sea area. What we think happened is the Edomites invaded because they heard of all his battles to the north, okay? Several hundred miles north of Jerusalem, as we just saw on the map. They apparently became convinced that because he'd spent so much time in warfare up there, that they could come in from Edom in the east, move to the west, and take over the southern part of Israel. But what we see here is that David therefore sends Abishai as one of his generals with the troops, and they end up going and defeating them down there. So that's what happens. So it's under the guise or umbrella of David as the warrior king, but one of his generals in this case is the one that has to go down there and do this particular battle. Now, let's go ahead and look back at verse 15. It says, so David reigned over all of Israel and David administered justice and righteousness for all his people. So, remember what David has done has created security for Israel. He has defeated nations all around it. He literally, if you look at the map, he's defeated nations to the north, to the east, to the south, and to the west. All of it. Entire circle. Yeah, Jack.
Is there any place where the Lord directed David to go with the troops? Since you said a lot of the kings did go with the troops, but when David went with them, they were successful.
There may be a verse, I can't remember it. I'd have to look at that. But there are many references, many references to David with his troops going out to war. They're all through First Kings, all through there. So I have to look and see if there's one specific verse. Okay, so what we see is, as a result of all this warfare and the success in them, David is able to secure domestically stability over Israel. One of the ways that he does that is in verse 15. Notice he says he administered justice and righteousness for all the people. He sets up courts, and he sets up administrators or judges of these courts, and they're mandated to provide justice and righteousness for the people. This is a fulfillment of Deuteronomy 16. Here, I'll turn there and read it to you. Deuteronomy 16. Deuteronomy 16 is where God sets up the court system. And it says, it's Deuteronomy 16, starting at verse 18. He says, you shall appoint for yourself judges and officers in your towns, which the Lord your God is giving you. According to your tribes, they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. You shall not distort justice. You shall not make it partial, and you shall not take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and perverts the words of the righteous. Is that not true?
Al Capone never heard of that.
That's right. And in verse 20, justice and only justice you shall pursue. You may live and possess the land which the Lord your God has given you. So that was what the Torah demanded, that laws in court should be, but it had really not been put into effect broadly. This is the first time that David demands, per Deuteronomy 16, that all the administrative judges that are set up do it in a correct and righteous way. It disallows prejudice based on your class. That is, the poor are supposed to have the same rights as the rich. It also disavows bribes and unfair influence. That is, if you do this for me, I'll do this for you.
Pro bono.
Pro bono. It disallows all those things. Because of this, it caused stability and a coherent Israel where there was a proper functioning Jewish society. No elitism. Underline that. No elitism. Can you imagine if you took all the elites out of all the governments of this planet, what would be like? We'd see
A whole lot different.
a whole lot different. We'd see a really different political and geopolitical activity if that were true. Because what do elites always do? They take the resources of their countries and they use the people and troops of their nations for their own purposes. Right? And that's what was disallowed. Now, let's read verses 16 and 17 in 2 Samuel 8. And Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was over the army, and Jehoshaphat, the son of Elihud, was recorder, and Zadok, the son of Elitub, and Abimelech, I'm sorry, Ahimelech, the son of Abiathar, were priests, and Sarah was secretary, and Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, was over the Cherites and the Pelethites, and David's sons were chief ministers. Now let's go through that and break it down to see what's going on here. This is a mention of the administrative officers of David's rule, of his administration. Okay? You will see, if you want to turn to it, that there's also a list of it mentioned in 1 Samuel 20, verses 23 through 26. I'm not going to turn there, but there is another mention of it. Joab, of course, David's nephew, is over the army, right? Now, this man named Jehoshaphat is, quote unquote, what's it say? It says he was the recorder, is the word that's used. The word there in Hebrew is Zakar. He was the Zakar. And of course, Zakar means a scribe or recorder, or more literally, a royal biographer. Okay? He's the guy that took down the whole history of David's works, political actions, wars, all these things.
Did
Okay?
he use a steno pass as they used to?
I'm certain he must have used, obviously scribal ink, and also, papyrus reed paper, et cetera, because that's typically what was used. Now, it also says Zadok was a high priest, and it says it was shared with Ahimelech. Now, you should probably think to yourself, so when is it that in Israel you had two high priests?
During the
I-
This is problematic. In other words, it was never meant to be. There were never meant to be two high priests. Now, what apparently happened here is this was a political accommodation, because it says that one was, whose father was Abiathar, who was indeed the high priest in the northern part of Israel, as we go back in our history of those tribes. And also in our history, we see that Zadok was viewed as the high priest of the southern part, Judah. So they were not following what we call Kohan rules. Kohan means a priest in Hebrew. They were not following the Kohan rules that were set up by the Torah during this time. If you remember in the book of Exodus, we see that Aaron had three sons. Remember?
Mm-hmm.
One of them was Eleazar, and only from the line of Eleazar could come the high priests. Now, so there's a violation here, which we end up seeing actually is corrected later. You'll see that in 2 Samuel by David. But it's probably a political accommodation. Also, it says that this Sarai is secretary, literally secretary of state, is really what his position is as you read the Hebrew. He's the applier of the rules, edicts, and policies of the king. Okay? Now, it says that Benai, okay, supervised both the Cherethites and the Pelethites. Now, who are the Cherethites and the Pelethites? Well, you have to go back to earlier in 1 Samuel, and that is they are small clans of tribes in the southern part of Philistia. Okay? They were warriors, and they were associated with the time when David was in the town of Ziklag, okay, where he did work for King Achash of Gath, back there, okay? Now, what they were mercenary bodyguards for David. That's who they are. Remember, they're not from Israel. They're paid mercenaries. They're actually Philistine in nature, okay? But the reason why is because they were to guard him in the palace because they didn't have a political agenda of any of the tribes of Israel. So they were,
Philistines, are they large or really large?
we don't know. We don't know. We know that they were tested warriors. They were a class of tested warriors that were from the southern Philistine area. So they were loyal or neutral to David. Notice that they were also, David separated the control of these warriors that were acting as bodyguards and palace police, and they reported to this guy, okay, Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada. They did not report to Joab, head of the army. So David, I think wisely, has his palace people as these mercenary paid bodyguards, where Joab has no control over that. He takes care of the army. So it separates out control in this way, and it, as a result, protects David more. Does that make sense?
Totally.
Okay. Now, let's finish this. I told you I think there's a typology in all of this. And I'm going to show you the evidence of that typology. Now, we see here a history, obviously, of these nations, leaders, and battles. But the question is, what theological significance is this? Is it just historical significance, or is there more to this? Now, I think that this is a typology that contains elements which are also typological of Messiah's millennial rule in the 1,000 years. And I'm going to show you why. Let me go to my next page here. So, I think there are 8 parallels that I'm going to show you, but I'm going to tell you from studying this, I think there's a whole lot more than 8 parallels. I could only get to 8 in this. All right, so turn, if you would, to Psalm chapter 2. Psalm 2.
We're talking about parallels
Between what goes on in the history of these nations that David defeats and the elements of David's empire and his rule, and I think they are typological of Messiah's 1,000-year reign, and I'm going to show you why. Okay? First, read in Psalm 2, verses 8 through 12, or I'll read for you. Ask of me, and I will surely give the nations as thy inheritance. There's the first parallel. God gives David all these nations as his inheritance. But in the millennial rule, God gives Messiah all the nations as his inheritance. Okay? He says, and to the very ends of the earth as a possession. Thou shalt break them with a rod of iron. They shall shatter them like earthware. You remember what we just read in 2 Samuel 8 about, and also in the Psalm we just read, how he shattered these nations, put garrisons among there to control them. No one could stand against him. Of course, this is exactly what Messiah does in the millennial kingdom too, as he comes into that kingdom. He says, thou shalt break them with a rod of iron. Thou shalt shatter them like earthenware. Now, therefore, O kings, show discernment. Take warning, O judges of the earth. Worship the Lord with reverence, and rejoice with trembling. Do homage to the Son, lest he become angry and you perish in the way. Sound like a parallel? Okay? This is what Messiah does in the millennial kingdom to set it up. But that's exactly what David did in conquering these nations in 2 Samuel 8. Do homage to the Son, lest he become angry, and you perish in the way, for his wrath may soon be kindled, and how blessed are all who take refuge in him. That, I think, is the first parallel. Okay, we see that David conquers, of course, all the way from north, south, east, and west. A large portion he conquers of ancient Middle East, including Ammon, Syria, Edom, Damascus, and lower Mesopotamia, as well as the south. So, huge area. And I think it's perfectly aligned, as we said, to what would happen as promised in Genesis 15, the Abrahamic covenant in the territory that would occur. It's exactly what David does. He takes control of all that area promised. This, of course, is called David and Solomon's golden age of Israel. During this time of David's reign and his son's reign, Solomon, no one is able to defeat Israel. They have control of all of this territory. Again, in parallel, Messiah will have control of all the nations. Now, second analogy or parallel. Turn to Isaiah chapter 11. To your right, where we are there. Isaiah 11. Okay, and we're going to look at Isaiah 11, verse 14. Oh, shoot. Did I write that down correctly?
Is it 10 or?
Just a second. Well, I'm sorry.
Look at verse 10.
Okay. Then it will come about in that day that that the nations will resort to the root of Jesse, who will stand as a signal for the people, and his resting place will be glorious. And you notice that he takes over in verse 11. He ends up taking over Assyria, Egypt, Pathros, Cush, Elam, which is Persia, Shinar, which is Mesopotamia, Hamath, which is that area we showed in the map, and all the islands. And of course, he will end up lifting up the standard for the nations, therefore will show control. It says at the end of verse 12, there it says, from the four corners of the earth. Remember, I just told you, David takes over the four corners of his territorial area, east, north, south, and west. So there's a parallel. Now, also, it states, okay, I apparently didn't write it down, I'm sorry. But in Isaiah 11, it states that Messiah will also rule the earth in justice and righteousness. And of course, we see the parallel with second Samuel 8, verse 15, where it says that David will set up the courts for proper justice. So that's another parallel. Thirdly, you're already in Isaiah 11. Look at Isaiah 11, verse 9. Let's see if I wrote this one correct. I'm really sorry. I don't think I wrote it down correctly. But at any rate.
It's verse 6.
Now.
Well, his name will be called one,
yeah.
and the government will be on his shoulders.
Yeah, well, what it says is that Messiah's kingdom will guarantee peace and safety from all the nations as a result of Messiah being on the earth, okay? In the same way, in the text as we read in 2 Samuel, David, of course, provides peace and safety for all of Israel. Now, also, it's interesting that in 2 Samuel 8, verse 13, we read there that it says David's name will be made great. And of course, also, we see that Messiah is the king over the entire earth, his name being, of course, the predominant one at the earth at that point. Why don't you try to go back and we'll see if I wrote this down correctly. Psalm 72. Let me read this to you. It says, give the king thy judgments, O God, and thy righteousness to the king's son. May he judge thy people with righteousness and thine afflicted with justice. Again, this whole reference to justice and righteousness. And he says, let the mountains bring peace to the people and the hills in righteousness. May he vindicate the afflicted of the people and save the children of the needy and crush the oppressor. In other words, the justice has to be meted out equally for all people, even the oppressed and the children of the poor. He says, let them fear while the sun endures, and as long as the moon throughout all generations. May he come down like the rain upon the mown grass, like showers that water the earth. In the days may the righteousness flourish in abundance of peace till the moon is no more. Again, a reference to the millennial kingdom of Messiah. May he also rule as far as the sea and from the river, that is the Euphrates, to the ends of the earth. In the same way that David captured all that territory, all the way to the Euphrates. He says, and let the nomads of the desert bow before him, and enemies lick the dust. Let the kings of Tarshish and the islands bring presents. Kings of Sheba and Seba offer gifts. And let all things bow down before him. All nations will serve him. So this is what happens. No nation can withstand the kingdom of David at this point. In the same way, the kingdom of Messiah, no nations will withstand. Now, as Messiah is of the millennial kingdom, will be appointed by the Lord under, it says, a new covenant. And let me see if I had this down correctly. I'm going to turn to Isaiah 42. Now, verse 6, Isaiah 42:6, it says, I am the Lord, I have called you in righteousness. I will also hold you by the hand and watch over you. Okay, and he's speaking about Messiah here. I will appoint you as a covenant, to the people, a light to the nations, to open blind eyes, to bring about prisoners from the dungeon, to those who dwell in darkness, etc., etc. This is a promise to Messiah, that Messiah will rule 1,000 years on the earth based on, quote, a new covenant. David rules at this time because of what?
Abrahamic covenant.
Well, fulfillment of that, but also 2 Samuel 7, the Davidic covenant. Remember, part of it, the Davidic covenant, is the territories promised. So both of them operate under covenants. So now, turn to Psalm 48, back to Psalm from Isaiah. Psalm 48. It's a famous psalm. We sing it sometimes. It's verses 1 and 2. Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised in the city of our God, his holy mountain. Beautiful in elevation, the joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion in the far north, city of the great king. Okay? This is a promise to Messiah. Where is he going to reign from?
Zion.
Right, from the city of Jerusalem and Mount Zion. Now, in the same way, we see that David conquers Jerusalem in the previous chapter, okay? He sets up his rulership in a palace in a place called the City of David, which is in the area of Mount Zion. So both rule from Mount Zion as a result. Now, also another parallel, David enters into a God-ordained war against pagan nations, and it's a God-led or driven, unstoppable army. You notice that? His army went through all these battles in all these nations and could not be stopped. Turn to Revelation 19. All the way to the end. Revelation 19. This, of course, is a chapter of the second return of Christ to the earth. Okay? We're going to read 11 through 16 of Revelation 19. This is how Messiah returns. Okay? Again, somehow people get the idea that don't understand the Bible well, I think, that Messiah's return to the earth is peaceful and he'll just descend somehow and everything will be copacetic. That is not how it happens.
He's
Okay?
coming on a white horse.
Exactly.
Which means
War. But verse 11, 19, Revelation 19. And I saw heaven open, and behold, just as Jan said, a white horse. He who sat on it called Faithful and True. And again, the emphasis, in righteousness he judges, and in the same way he wages war. And his eyes are a flame of fire, and upon his head are many diadems, and he has a name written upon them which no one knows except himself. And he's clothed with a robe dipped in blood. Why do you think it says that?
Because he marches to 200 miles.
Because we know in other texts that he marches 200 miles from the area of Petra down around and all the way up to the Jezreel Valley, and it's a march of slaughter.
Mhm.
That's why his robe is dipped in blood. And he says, and his name is called the Word of God. Verse 14, and the enemies which are in heaven, clothed in fine linen, white and clean, were following him on white horses. Who do you suppose that is?
Saints.
Who is it? Who is coming from heaven with him as he comes with an army?
his angel.
His angels. He has an angelic army. In the Hebrew, tasaba. That's the word, angelic army. So he also commandeers and leads a giant army. But in the case of Messiah, it's an angelic army. Where in David's case, it's his literal army. Yes.
I'm a little confused. When did the believers come then from heaven? Or the people, like, because I thought we came with him
Well,
when he came back.
we don't come back with him at this point. Okay. You know, this is the point of his entry in warfare to the earth. Okay. You know, we don't know when
This is Armageddon.
right, this is Armageddon. We don't know when we will leave the earth in the rapture. But at a point in time, the saints, of course, will come with him, but this is not the time.
Oh, okay.
Okay? Notice again, verse 15, and from his mouth comes a sharp sword. That is, what does he come to do?
Kill.
Kill, warfare, so that with it he may smite the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron, and he treads the winepress of his fierce wrath of God the Almighty. And on his on his robe and on his thigh, he has a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So, just as David rules an army that's unstoppable, Messiah comes back to earth with an army unstoppable. It's another parallel. Okay, now, David reigns over a territory that, of course, going into the reign of Solomon, and of course, that is the golden age. That's the period in which no one disturbs Israel. Now, as time goes on, and you have the split of the kingdom after Solomon dies, and Rehoboam and Jeroboam become the kings of the north and the south, then, of course, we find that there ends up being attacks upon Israel, and nations go against Israel at that point, invade, right? Okay, now,
Israel being the 10 northern kingdoms
no, Israel overall.
overall.
Okay. Now, in an analogy, Messiah reigns over generations of people during 1,000 years, but towards the end of that 1,000 years, nations rebel and they attack Messiah's kingdom. I'm going to read it to you. I'm staying in Revelation 19. I'm going to Revelation 20, and I'm going to read you verses 7 and 8. And when the 1,000 years are completed, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth. David was conquering the four corners of his territory, analogy. And Gog and Magog, to gather them together for the war, and the number of them is like the sand of the shore. And they came up on the broad plain of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city, and fire came down from heaven and devoured them. So, just like under David, at the end of the reign of Solomon, that empire that he created became ravaged by other nations under the split rulership of Jeroboam and Rehoboam. In the same way, analogously, the kingdom of Messiah reigns for 1,000 years, but towards the end of it, nations rebel against him, and he has to then put down those nations. So in both cases, that occurs. Now, finally, David allows the nations to self-govern under the supervision of these, quote, garrisons, right? In analogy, Messiah during 1,000 years will reign over the nations with, quote, a rod of iron. We see that in Revelation 2, verse 27. We also see in Isaiah 11:4 that those nations still have kings. So even under the rule of Messiah in the millennium, those nations still have kings and they have a certain level of autonomy, but it's inside the supervision of Messiah. And if they do anything, they'll catch the rod of iron that will bring them back into compliance. We see this in Revelation 20, verse 8, as I mentioned, these nations which come up against him. They will obey Messiah in the millennial kingdom, but they also will be punished when they're out of line. I want you finally to turn to Isaiah 60. To finish this, go back to the book of Isaiah at the end, chapter 60. And I want you to look he says, speaking of the millennial kingdom and Messiah, for the nation and the kingdom which will not serve you will perish, and the nations will be utterly ruined. So they'll have nations, there'll be people, they'll have leaders, but they cannot step out of line. Just like when David put the garrisons in all these nations to correct them if they dare step out of line. Yes?
Was that verse 12?
That was verse, that was,
12?
yes, is verse 12 of Isaiah 60. Okay? Now, also, to finish this, turn a little bit further in Isaiah to actually the last chapter. It's Isaiah 66. I want to show you another reference about how the nations lived, but they had to come in compliance with Messiah's rulership. And it's in verses 23 and 24 of Isaiah 66. And it shall be from new moon to new moon, and from Sabbath to Sabbath, all mankind will come to bow down before me, says the Lord. Now, if you look further, which I'm not obviously going to go into tonight, there are a variety of verses that say that in the millennial kingdom, the nations also must operate according to the Jewish calendar. And if they don't operate and bring offerings during the time, particularly the last three feasts of the year, what will happen is they will not get rain on their crops. So there's all kinds of obligations that the nations end up having to Messiah. Verse 24, then they shall go forth and look on the corpses of the men. Who are these men? The corpses of who? Of the nations that didn't obey what the Messiah told them to do.
Transgressed against.
And transgressed against him. Okay? They will look on the corpses of the men who have transgressed against me, for their worm shall not die, and their fire shall not be quenched, and they shall be an abhorrence to all mankind. That is, they're going to be made an example of. Okay, those are 8 reasons why I think that the history in 2 Samuel 8 is also typological and tells us an analogy of what will go on in the Messianic kingdom. So, at any rate, that was probably a little longer than you wanted, but I tried to at least make some sense using your map of what has gone over here in 2 Samuel 8. So let me pray and we'll close for tonight. All right, Lord, thank you for this time. Thank you for your word. Thank you that the Bible defines the Bible. That when we find a verse that maybe is not clear, we almost always, through cross references, can find other verses that give us more information about it. All these things are built into your word so that we know that it's one complete testament. We thank you for your division and dividing, for your illumination through the word, that we can see these things that you want us to see. So we pray these things tonight in Christ's name. Amen.